Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to place a motion that the General Manager, Parks, Forestry and Recreation give notice to the Toronto District School Board terminating the existing City TDSB agreement by April 30th, and the General Manager, Parks, Forestry and Recreation work with the Toronto Lands Corporation and the Aquatic Working Group to develop a new agreement that addresses community pool access in an affordable manner and report back to the Parks and Environment Committee. There's the motion. And I'd like to thank the leadership of Councillor Robinson specifically and Councillor Berardinetti on this motion, because certainly they recognize the value that when we have shared use facilities, the value that that brings. And so I hope that I will get your support on this motion, because this will allow us to continue to provide affordable programming in our shared facilities. And then I'd like to take a moment to speak to the larger issues that are facing Council today. And I'd like to start with what unites us, and really why all of us got elected. Right? All of us got elected because we want to leave the city a little stronger than how we found it. All of us were compelled to run to do our part to make this city great. And the question before the Council is, what are the kinds of goals and aspirations that we are going to adopt to make this city great? And we have a budget that has come together that is a consensus budget by and large, that has a reasonable tax rate, that has reasonable service adjustments, that has a reasonable strategy around who should pay and why they should pay and who can afford to pay. It also has protections for those who can't pay. And so this budget actually contains the values of this Council and this city. And I believe that very strongly. And then we have a motion that seems a little innocuous. You know, just for $15 million, we can solve the problems, and we can have a united council, and we can save these programs. But let's talk about these programs. And I want to, because they're important. Because what we're talking about, first of all, is almost $2 million to reinstate a subsidy that actually has no bearing on the ability to pay. And it's very important, because you think when you take from a subsidy that nobody's paying, or a surplus rather. If we take from a surplus, nobody's paying. But in fact, every single one of us paid into that surplus. Every single one of us. And so what is that child care subsidy? You know what that child care subsidy is? That goes to me and my family. Because I have 2 kids that are in school programming, that are in a school-based daycare. And it becomes a question of fairness. Why should the people who pay property tax in Jane and Finch pay for my daycare? Why should the people who live in some of the most disadvantaged areas of the city pay for my daycare? I can afford to pay for my own daycare. And the people in North Toronto would agree that if you have a subsidy for daycare, it should be targeted to those who cannot pay, not those who can. And I heard that from the women's group that came out to protest some of the cuts at City Hall. They said, don't pay for the daycare of people who make $100 grand. Have targeted daycare to pay for those who need. And that's not what this motion does. And then when we talk about the TTC service, you know what? Let me tell you, folks, it hasn't been a fun 2 years being chair of the TTC where I'm cutting routes and adjusting service. And so it's a simple question. We'll just stop doing it. You know what? I'd love to stop doing it, but we can't afford it anymore. And if this motion goes back to give service that we can't afford next year, you know what we do? Next year we cut again. And that's what this motion does. It puts money we don't have back into a budget that we just cut next year. And again, we go back to the people and we say, sorry, sorry. And I need to stop for a minute and remind everybody that these choices have implications. Because when I was first elected in 2003, we had a budget hole that was $60 million. And you know how we filled it? We sold hydro poles. The next year was $90 million. And you know how we filled that? Do you remember how we filled that? We sold the land underneath the Ontario Science Centre. And then the next year we had a budget hole of about $130 million, and after we took from our various reserve pots and we tried to look at things to do, we realized we had a problem. And so we asked the province of Ontario to give us new taxing powers. The year after that, we didn't have enough money, and we already sold our light lamps. We already sold the land under the Science Centre. We ran out of things to sell, so we imposed the land transfer tax and the vehicle registration tax. And we raised property taxes beyond the rate of inflation. And then the people of Toronto said, well, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do now to pay for this budget that we cannot afford? And so what are we going to do now? Now we're looking at selling hydro. Now we're looking at selling our assets. Now we're looking at selling our theatres. Now we're looking at selling our zoos. And the reason we're looking at selling those assets is because we made decisions to spend money we didn't have.
Councillor Stintz, would you like an extension?
Yes, please.
Okay, recorded vote.
No, she didn't start the
Well,
I'm sorry, the timers are
yeah, that's not mine.
out of whack, but I have it. I'm sure you do. Well, I can reset it for 2 minutes. Yeah.
Councillor Mihevc, please. Councillor McConnell, Councillor Robinson.
Councillor McMahon, please, and Councillor Davis.
The motion to extend the speaking time carries 36-1.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So nobody came here, nobody got elected because they want to cut service. Everybody got elected because they wanted to leave the city stronger. And I beg you, and I plead with you, that when you make these decisions, we don't build a stronger city giving subsidies to people who don't need them. We don't build a stronger city reinstating service that we know we can't afford to pay for next year. We don't buy the confidence of the public when we tell them we can do something when we know full well we can't. And the reality is I was also in this chamber and I voted for the streetcar purchase knowing full well that we didn't have a federal partner beside us to pay for those streetcars. And now we live with that decision too. There's $154 million that's a surplus. The fact that it's a surplus doesn't mean that somebody didn't pay for it. The people of Toronto paid for that surplus. And we need to be extremely judicious around how we spend that money. And we have an obligation to the people who are going to rely on those streetcars to use that money to pay down our obligation and to reinvest in our streetcar fleet that is right now over 30 years old. That's our obligation. That is how we build a stronger city. That is how we get the respect and the confidence of the people who elected us to be here. We didn't get sent here to make easy choices. None of us did. And in fact, I'm sure some of the choices we're being asked to make were more difficult than the ones that we thought we were going to have to make when we went out and we asked the public for their confidence. But we maintain their confidence by being honest about what we can afford to pay, what we can afford to do, how we should do it, and how we make sure that the limited funds that we have go towards the people who need it the most so that we build a city that protects our values and makes it a place that our children can afford to stay and build their families and their futures in. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor de Bearmaker.
Thank you, Madam